In this next part of the big story, we're going to meet two new types of character who are going to move the story on again. They're going to show us what the character of God is like, and they're going to lead us as disciples in understanding other ways in which we can be involved in the whole point of the big story. What's the whole point of the big story? Remember, right back at the start, that God is a God of love who desires to bless all people on the earth through you and I. So far, our story has involved the promise of blessing and the presence of God. Remember, the promise was originally given to one man, to Abraham. That one man grew into a whole family. That family keeps growing and growing and growing until finally they move down to Egypt, where they're enslaved and they have to be rescued by a God who demonstrates his power over earthly kings and over nature. The leader of that people when they were rescued was Moses, a shepherd who nurtured and cared for the people, who led them towards safety and found them food and water. This shepherd was given both the commandments, the laws, which help us as the people of God to demonstrate our unique way of living amongst others. And he was also given the system of sacrifice, which was an old system, but that was the system that was the way that God removed shame and guilt from people and allowed people to be forgiven and brokenness to be healed and a closeness with God to be restored and maintained. Finally, God leads them into the promised land, a place where they can have goodness and safety and peace. They've been rescued from a bad place. They've been given a great place. And they're led by Joshua, a warrior. And it's all going to be good. Except, as we found out last time, very quickly, pride and envy and jealousy and arrogance and anger and bitterness all find themselves being thrown into the mix really, really fast. And things go south, as the judges who lead all these tribes aren't able to maintain peace. So now, to restore peace and goodness and calm and rightness, we need a new type of leader. We need a king and we need a prophet. And the first prophet we're going to meet is somebody called Samuel. But before we meet him, we should find out, what's a prophet? Profit, you say. A profit's all about the money. You have your incoming, you have your outgoing, and whatever you've got left when you paid your expenses, that's the profit. No, this is a prophet with a PH. These are people who exist throughout this part of our story, and they're often, they get themselves a reputation. They sometimes live on the edge of the town. They sometimes they're a bit weird, quite frankly. We're going to meet a load in the future chapters of our story. Like, there's one guy who lays down on the side of the road for over a year, giving himself a serious case of pins and needles in his arm. And while he's doing that, he cooks his food over a fire, and instead of using logs for the fire, he uses cow dung and animal dung. Gross. They do weird stuff sometimes as a kind of symbolic act of storytelling to speak to people, because he didn't have cinema and film and Facebook back then. But they also care passionately about God and about God's words and about God's ways and about God's glory. In fact, they care so much about that they don't really care about anything or anyone else. They don't mind going up to powerful, important people, like kings, for instance, and saying, "You're not doing it God's way." Whilst everybody else is too afraid to talk to you like this, I'm not, because I'm a prophet and I work for God. And so sometimes the rich, powerful, important people don't like the prophets because they're inconvenient. But always they've got their eyes fixed on God, on righteousness and justice, and about exposing religion that's just religion for religion's sake, and promoting goodness and rightness and the real way of worshipping and living for God. So back to Samuel. He was dedicated to the service of God in the temple by his mum. His birth is quite a story, and he grows up in this temple serving God. He grows up in the ways of wisdom. He grows up in the practices of listening for the voice of God in all things. And he grows up quite unique because still, remember, everybody else around him is driven by what they want, what they can get. Everybody's driven by having to get power for themselves. So he stands out as quite unique. He's the man who listens to God, who does the things that God asks him to do, that obeys the law that was given to Moses, that goes through the sacrificial system, always looking for a right relationship with God. As he grows up, people don't really get him, but they do admire him. And so finally, one day, the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel, they come to Samuel and they say, "Enough! We can't take it anymore. The whole land is riddled with arguments, division, bitterness. We're just ripping each other apart. Nobody's enjoying living here. Everybody else has a king. We've just got these judges and that's not working out for us. We need a king and we need you, Samuel, to find the king for us. When you find the king, put a crown on his head and we'll all follow that king." Samuel says, "No way. No way. Everybody else has a king." And remember, just because everybody else is doing it, that doesn't mean it's the way of God. Look at all the other places. They have a king and they start to treat that king as God. They make that king all powerful. They follow that king into battle. They spend all their time in the fields making sure that the king has got enough grain to make bread and sheep to make tasty lamb skewers, and everything goes towards that king in taxes and in feasts and in battles, and that king gets more powerful, and it doesn't really ever work out well for anybody else. That isn't the way we're going to do it. "We want a king," say the people. So Samuel agrees to go and pray. And he asks God. And God says, "You know what? Give them a king." It wasn't what Samuel wanted, but remember, Samuel's a prophet. The prophet cares only about the will and the ways and the words of God. And so, having listened to God say, "Give them a king," Samuel finds a king. He finds a man named Saul. We don't know much about him at the start, except he was very tall. Maybe people called him Tall Saul. But he was also good in battle. He was also a good leader of people. And he also seemed to be the kind of person that God might want to be a king. And so Samuel anoints him as king in this weird ceremony by pouring oil over his head and in his beard and giving him some kind of crown and declaring that this Saul is God's chosen king for the people of Israel. But think about it. If you're the first king of a nation, if you're the first king of the nation because God chose you, because you're super tall and just better than all of the others, if you're the first king of the nation who's better than all the others and it starts to go well and you start to win battles and you start to have peace in the land, what do you suddenly think? It might be about me. I might be a great king. I might be the person people should worship. I might be the person who should have all the power. Forget God. He's given all the power to me. And as we know, this is when it can go wrong.